Welcome back to the channel, and if you are here for the first time, you have chosen the perfect story to begin your journey with us. Before we dive in, take a moment to get comfortable, because what you are about to experience is not just a story. It is a testament to what happens when one person refuses to stop believing, even when the entire world tells them they are foolish for trying. If that kind of story speaks to your soul, hit that like button right now and make sure you are subscribed, so you never miss a single chapter of what we create here together. And now, let us begin. Part 1. The Last Guardian. The temple had no name anymore. That was the first thing Lyra Ashvale had learned to accept about her life. The slow erasure of everything her family had built and protected and bled for across 7 generations of faithful service. The world called the structure many things, most of them unkind. The ruin on Greymount, the madwoman's shrine, the Ashvale folly, travelers who came. Through the valley below sometimes pointed up at the ancient stone edifice perched against the mountain's shoulder, and told their children it was proof that some bloodlines carried a peculiar kind of stubbornness that bordered on illness, a refusal to accept that some things simply did not matter anymore, and had not mattered for a very long time. Lyra had heard all of it. She had heard it from the merchants who came through Greenvale Township twice a year with their wagons and their news from the larger territories. She had heard it from the pack elders who occasionally made the journey up the switchback path to the temple's outer courtyard. Not out of reverence, but out of what she suspected was a morbid curiosity. The way people slow down when they pass something broken. She had heard it most painfully from the young wolves her age, who had grown up alongside her in the township below, who had formed bonds and found mates and built futures while she remained on the mountain with her. Candles and her rituals and her stubborn, inherited faith. She was 23 years old. She was Omega, which in the current social structure of the Greyvale territory meant she occupied the lowest rung of a hierarchy that was itself considered provincial and outdated by the larger council territories to the east. She had no formal pack affiliation, because the Ashvale family had long ago surrendered their pack ties when they accepted the sacred duty of the guardianship. She had no mate, no prospects, no social standing to speak of beyond the whispered reputation of being the last of the temple crazy women. She had her mother's old journals, her grandmother's ritual texts, a garden she kept meticulously in the courtyard's southern corner, and the flame. The flame was everything. It burned in a basalt bowl at the center of the temple's innermost sanctum, a circular chamber carved from the living rock of the mountain itself, its walls covered in carvings so ancient that even the oldest scholarly texts Lyra had managed to acquire through years of careful correspondence with university archivists could only speculate about their meaning. The flame was not large, not dramatic in the way she imagined sacred things were supposed to be. It burned perhaps the size of a doubled fist, a steady low fire that consumed no visible fuel and produced no smoke. Its color during ordinary times a warm amber gold that cast the carved walls in shifting patterns of light and shadow. It had burned without interruption for as long as the Ashvale records extended, which was to say more than 300 years of meticulous documentation, though the oral traditions her grandmother had passed down suggested the flame itself was far older, tied to a period in werewolf history so distant it had passed entirely into myth and legend. The Ashvale Guardians did not know exactly what the flame was for. This was a humbling truth that Lyra had wrestled with since adolescence, when she first became old enough to truly understand the implications of her family's position. They knew the rituals. They knew the offerings. They knew the lunar calendar observations, and the blood renewal ceremonies performed at each solstice and equinox. Small ritual cuts to the palm, drops of Ashvale blood fed carefully to the flame, which always received such offerings with a momentary brightening, a warmth that seemed to press against the skin like gratitude. They knew the flame must never be allowed to die. They knew that to abandon the guardianship was to invite a consequence their texts described only as the unraveling, something catastrophic and irreversible that would affect not just the Ashvale line, but the entire werewolf world. What they did not know was why, what slept beneath the temple, waiting, what the flame was actually guarding. Lyra's mother had died without knowing, her grandmother before her, and her great-grandmother before that. The knowledge, if it had ever been fully articulated, had been lost somewhere in the chain of generations, burned away by a fire in the archive room during her great-great-grandmother's tenure, or perhaps never written down at all, because whoever established the guardianship had believed the why was self-evident, obvious to anyone with eyes to see and a heart willing to understand. Lyra tended the flame anyway. She tended it with the same meticulous care her mother had demonstrated, the same quiet reverence her grandmother had modeled. During those early childhood years when Lyra had been small enough to sit on the sanctum floor and watch the old woman perform the evening observations, murmuring the old words in a language neither of them fully understood, her weathered hands moving through the ritual gestures with the ease of long practice, Lyra had memorized everything. She had innovated where necessary, cross-referencing the fragmentary ritual texts with whatever academic scholarship she could access, making careful notes in the margins of her own journal about variations she had tested and their effects on the flame's behavior. The flame responded to her. Not to everyone, she knew this because over the years, various people had entered the sanctum, usually the curious ones, the skeptical pack elders who wanted to stand before the thing they dismissed and satisfy themselves that there was nothing genuinely supernatural about it. The flame did not respond to them the way it responded to her. For them, it simply burned, indifferent and ordinary-looking. For Lyra, it leaned, a subtle but unmistakable movement of the fire toward her when she entered the sanctum, like a dog lifting its head when it hears its owner's footstep in the hall. It brightened slightly when she spoke the old words. It settled and steadied when she was calm, and it flickered in agitation, though never going out, when she was distressed or frightened. She had stopped telling people about these things years ago. The response was always the same: gentle condescension from the kinder ones, outright mockery from the less charitable. She was projecting human qualities onto a fire. She was experiencing the kind of isolation-induced magical thinking that was an expected consequence of spending too much time alone on a mountain. She was her mother's daughter, which was to say she was sweet, but ultimately unwell, in the particular way the Ashvale women tended to be unwell. Lyra ignored them, and kept her journals and tended her flame, and watched the lunar calendar with the careful attention of someone who had learned that patterns, however obscure, always meant something, which was why she had known, for the past 11 months, that the upcoming eclipse was different. She had found the reference in her great-great-grandmother Mara's archive notes, a single page that had survived the fire by virtue of having been tucked inside a different volume, folded and forgotten, and only discovered when Lyra had been doing her annual reorganization of the archive room 3 winters ago. The page described an astronomical event Mara called the Crimson Convergence, a lunar eclipse of a specific and extremely rare configuration, occurring when the moon passed through both the Earth's shadow and what Mara described as the cosmic thread, a term she did not define, but referenced as though it were common knowledge. The last Crimson Convergence, Mara wrote, had occurred 5 centuries ago. The next, according to her calculations, would occur in what was to Mara's time a distant future, but was. Lyra realized with a cold shock that sent her to the floor of the archive room, with her back against the shelving and her hands shaking, approximately 3 generations from Mara's writing, which placed it, if Lyra's mathematics were correct, and she had checked them 17 times over the following weeks, in this year, this autumn, the 3rd night of the 10th month. Mara's notes about the Crimson Convergence were fragmented, the survival of the page being partial, the edges burned and brittle. But what Lyra could read was enough to make her heart hammer every time she thought about it. On this night, Mara wrote, "The flame will seek. Do not fear what the seeking reveals. The guardian who stands at the convergence carries the weight of all who came before her. She must not flinch. She must not abandon her post. Whatever emerges, she must remember that the flame chose her line for a reason, and the reason was not weakness." Whatever emerges. Lyra had read those words so many times they had become a kind of prayer, a mantra she repeated to herself in the dark hours of the night, when the mountain wind pressed against the temple walls and the flame's shadows danced across the carved faces of ancient figures she could not name. Whatever emerges. She did not know what it meant. She did not know if she was prepared. But she was here, and she was the last guardian, and she was not going to abandon her post. The third night of the 10th month arrived cold and clear, the kind of autumn night that made the stars look close enough to touch, the air carrying the mineral scent of frost beginning to form on stone. Lyra had spent the preceding 3 days in intensive preparation, cleaning the sanctum with ritual care, refreshing the offering bowls, rereading every relevant passage in every text she possessed, and trying very hard not to think about the fact that she was doing all of this alone, as she did everything, with no one to call if something went wrong and no training beyond what she had absorbed from texts and memory and her own years of faithful practice. She dressed carefully in the ritual white that the Ashvale Guardians wore for major ceremonies, a simple linen shift that had been her mother's and her grandmother's before that, mended and cleaned so many times it was more repair than original fabric, and she found this comforting rather than sad because it meant she wore her lineage. Against her skin, carried all of them with her into whatever the night would bring. She braided her dark hair in the traditional guardian style, the 7-strand braid that her grandmother had taught her with patient hands when Lyra was 8 years old. She prepared the ritual blade, a small curved knife of ancient make that lived in a cedar box on the archive room's highest shelf, cleaned and consecrated, and used only for the blood offerings. She walked into the sanctum as the eclipse began. The flame knew immediately. She had barely crossed the sanctum threshold when the fire changed. Not dramatically, not with the sudden explosion she had half feared and half expected, but in the subtle way that things of great age and great power move when they have been patient for a very long time and are now allowing themselves the luxury of anticipation. The amber gold shifted toward something deeper, a richer, more saturated gold threaded with the first hints of white. The flame grew taller, by perhaps 2 inches. The light it cast changed quality, becoming sharper and somehow more present, less like firelight and more like something alive in its own right, regarding the room around it. Lyra walked to her position at the observation circle, a ring of carved symbols set into the floor around the basalt bowl, and she stood at the northern point as the ritual required. And she breathed, and she tried to quiet the hammering of her heart. She spoke the opening words of the convergence rite, the specific variation she had reconstructed from Mara's notes and the general solstice ceremony, adapting where the text was incomplete and trusting her years of practice to guide her instincts. The flame responded to each phrase, brightening in what she had come to read as confirmation, as yes, as you are doing this correctly. Keep going. The eclipse deepened overhead, invisible to her in the roofed sanctum, but felt in the change of the flame's color, which shifted from gold-white to something that held just at its edges the faintest blush of red. The crimson convergence. She understood now why Mara had named it that. She spoke the middle portion of the rite, the offerings, the acknowledgments of those who had come before, and when she reached the blood offering, she drew the ritual blade across her left palm in the practiced diagonal cut that left a clean line of pain and a welling of red that she cupped carefully and held over the flame. What happened next was not supposed to happen. She knew, as it was happening, that it was not supposed to happen, because the blood offering was a controlled thing, a few drops allowed to fall and no more. And she had performed this exact motion dozens of times without incident. But as the first drops fell and the flame leaped up to receive them with its usual brightening, the stone rim of the basalt bowl, which was ancient and had never given her any trouble in years of ritual use, cracked. It cracked sharply, with a sound like a gunshot in the enclosed space that made her flinch violently, and the flinch sent her hand lurching forward, and instead of a few careful drops, she poured a full, streaming flood of blood from her cupped palm directly into the heart of the flame. The flame exploded. There was no other word for it. The fire did not simply grow. It detonated upward and outward in a column of white gold light so brilliant that Lyra was blinded instantly, throwing herself backward with a cry and hitting the sanctum, floor hard enough to knock the breath from her body. She felt the heat, not burning, not painful, but enormous. A presence of warmth so vast, it was less like standing near a fire, and more like being embraced by something that had been waiting to do exactly this for centuries. The light pressed through her closed eyelids. She heard, beneath the roaring of the expanded flame, a sound she had never heard in all her years in the sanctum. A deep, resonant tone, like the lowest register of an enormous bell, felt more in the chest and the bones than heard with the ears. A vibration that traveled through the stone floor and up through her body, and made her teeth ache and her eyes water behind her squeezed lids. And then the floor cracked. Not just the basalt bowl. The floor of the sanctum itself, the ancient carved stone that had been solid and unwavering for as long as any record existed, fractured in a pattern that radiated outward from the base of the flame's bowl like a starburst. Cracks, running outward to the walls, and also inward, downward, revealing at the very center of the chamber a seam that had been invisible, perfectly disguised by the ancient stonecutters who had placed it there. A seam that now widened and deepened, and with a grinding that vibrated in Lyra's back teeth, began to open. Lyra scrambled to her feet. Her left hand was still bleeding. The flame was still roaring above her, white and enormous and more alive than she had ever seen it. And the seam in the floor was widening into a gap, and the gap was widening into an opening, and from below, from whatever lay beneath the sanctum that no Ashvale guardian had ever known about, and perhaps had never been meant to find this way, came a rush of cold air, carrying the scent of deep earth and something else. Something layered beneath the mineral cold. Something that her omega senses processed as alpha in the most profound and fundamental way she had ever encountered the concept. Not the ordinary alpha scent of pack leaders and territorial wolves, but something so ancient and concentrated and other that her entire body responded to it before her mind had any chance to intervene. Her knees nearly giving out, her breath stopping in her chest, every instinct she possessed going absolutely still and absolutely attentive in the way prey goes still, but was not about prey at all, was about recognition, about her body knowing something her mind was still catching up to. From below the temple, from beneath 500 years of stone and seal and waiting, something began to rise. Part 2. What sleeps beneath? He came out of the darkness slowly, which was the only mercy of the moment, because if it had been sudden, Lyra suspected she would have simply fled, and the entire situation would have resolved itself very differently. Instead, she had time. Standing at the edge of the opened floor, with the flame roaring behind her, and her bleeding hand pressed against her chest, and her heart doing something that was not quite fear and not quite wonder, but contained elements of both, to register what she was seeing in stages. Hands first, large hands gripping the edge of the opened stone, the knuckles white with effort, the fingers long and the grip suggesting enormous strength held carefully in check. Then arms, bare to the elbow where the tattered remnants of what had once been a formal garment fell away, the muscles moving under skin that was pale in the way of someone who had not seen sunlight in a very long time, not the pallor of illness but the pallor of absence, of being kept from light. Then shoulders, broad and set with the tension of someone lifting themselves from a great depth, and then finally a head and a face. He was, by any reasonable assessment, the most devastatingly beautiful person Lyra had ever seen, and she hated that this was the first coherent thought her mind produced, because it seemed profoundly inadequate to the situation. His face was all sharp angles and old. Authority, the bones of someone who had been born to command and had been commanding for so long, it had simply become part of the architecture of his expression, the set of his jaw, the line of his brow. His hair was dark and too long, matted with what she hoped was only dust and the passage of time. His eyes, when they found hers across the width of the sanctum, were a color she had no name for. Not quite gray, and not quite silver, and not quite the pale gold she associated with high ranking. Alphas. But something that shifted between all three and settled on none of them. Regarding her with an intensity that felt like being gripped, he said something in a language she did not know. His voice was extraordinary, deep and slightly rough with long disuse. carrying an authority that resonated in the same way the bell tone had resonated, in the chest, in the bones, in the instinctual parts of the brain that predated language entirely. When she did not respond, something shifted in his expression, a confusion that looked strange on features built for certainty. "Who?" he said, in old accented common tongue so archaic she had to work to parse it. "Are you?" It was not quite a question. It was the voice of someone who expected answers to present themselves. "Lyra," she said. Her voice was steadier than she had any right to expect. "Lyra Ashvale, I am the guardian of the flame." She paused. Her heart was hammering. Her hand was still bleeding. "Who are you?" Across his face at her question, a complex series of expressions too rapid to fully read, surprise, and something older. Something that looked almost like grief, pressed flat almost immediately by the return of that commanding composure. He had pulled himself fully out of the opening now, and stood before her on the sanctum floor. And he was tall, considerably taller than she had expected, and the tatters of his clothing resolved themselves on closer inspection as the remnants of formal ceremonial dress, dark fabric with metalwork at the collar, and cuffs that had once been elaborate and was now corroded and worn, the garb of someone who had been sealed below the earth in the clothing they had been wearing when they were put there. "Cale," he said. "Cale Dawnshield." He looked around the sanctum, taking in the flame, which had subsided somewhat, but still burned higher and whiter than Lyra had ever seen it, and the cracked floor, and the carved walls. His expression when he looked at the walls was one she recognized from her own reflection when she stood in the sanctum and felt the weight of what she did not know and could not understand. "How long?" he said quietly. "How long have you been down there?" she asked. He looked at her. "Yes. According to the historical records," Lyra said carefully, "the last confirmed sighting of the Alpha Eternal was approximately 500 years ago. The records are incomplete because much of what was written about him during that period was later suppressed by the Council of Elders. The silence that followed her words was not empty. It was the specific kind of silence that exists in the moment between a match being struck and a fire taking hold. A silence full of potential and danger. 500 years, Cale said softly. And then he said nothing else for a very long moment, and Lyra watched him absorb this the way stone absorbs water, slowly and from the outside in, his face remaining controlled while something behind his eyes moved and shifted and settled into a new configuration. She watched him choose not to be destroyed by the information, which she thought was one of the most remarkable things she had ever witnessed. "You said the council suppressed records," he said at last. His voice had changed slightly. There was something careful in it now, the careful of someone approaching something sharp. "Yes," Lyra said. "The scholarly consensus, in the limited academic work that has been done on this period, is that the historical record around the Alpha Eternal's disappearance is unusually sparse, given his significance. Some researchers have proposed deliberate suppression. Others attribute it to the general disruptions of the Consolidation Wars." She hesitated. "I have my own theory. Tell me." She looked at him steadily. He was still standing at the edge of the opened floor, had not moved toward her, which she noted and appreciated, though she was not sure he had done it deliberately. He was cataloging the room with the systematic attention of someone who had been trained to assess situations rapidly and completely. He looked, beneath the 500 years of imprisonment and the tattered clothing and the too long hair, like someone who had been very good at staying alive in difficult circumstances. "My great-great-grandmother's archive notes suggest that the flame was created to serve a specific purpose," Lyra said. "Not simply as a sacred object of general reverence, but as a seal. A guardian mechanism. The kind of thing you build when you need to be certain that what is contained remains contained, and that what contains it remains sustained." She met his gaze. "The Ashvale women were not appointed to tend a sacred flame out of tradition. We were appointed to tend a prison, and I think the people who built that prison were the same people who later suppressed the historical record about it." Cale was quiet for a long moment. His jaw had tightened almost imperceptibly. "The Council of Elders," he said. Yes. Who currently governs the werewolf territories? The 9 major territories, yes. The council has held governing authority for approximately 480 years. She paused. Which aligns with the period shortly after your documented disappearance. The silence was different this time, fuller, heavier with implication. They told my people I chose to ascend, Kyle said. His voice was very quiet. That is the phrase they used in the old tradition. An alpha of sufficient age and power could choose to ascend beyond physical form, to become part of the spiritual fabric of the pack world rather than remaining in bodily existence. It was considered a great honor. They told my people that I chose this, willingly, at the apex of my power, as a gift to the territories I had united. And instead, Lyra said softly, instead they sealed me beneath my own temple, Kale said, in the body I was born with 500 years to spend alone in, the dark. Lyra thought about what that meant. She turned it over in her mind with the care she brought to all difficult things. All the things that could shatter if handled wrong. 500 years. She had spent 23 years alone on a mountain, and there were nights when the isolation pressed so heavily she could feel it like a physical weight on her chest. And she had the stars and her garden and her journals, and occasionally a merchant to speak to. And she could not begin to imagine. 500 years of absolute nothing, except the stone and the cold, and the weight of a betrayal committed by people you had trusted. I'm sorry, she said. It was inadequate. She knew it was inadequate. But she said it with her whole chest, with genuine feeling, and she saw something flicker in his expression that was too brief to name, but was not nothing. You did not do it, he said. No, but I am the representative of the institution that sustained your imprisonment. Even unknowingly. She held his gaze. The Ashvale Guardians were told we were tending a sacred fire. We were not told we were keeping someone alive in a sealed chamber beneath it, maintaining the seal that held an innocent person captive. Her voice had developed an edge she had not entirely intended. I would like you to know that if I had known, I would not have done it. Kale looked at her for a long, assessing moment. I believe you, he said. Something released in her chest that she had not entirely known was clenched. Good, she said. Now. Your hand is bleeding. She looked down. Her left palm, which she had been pressing against her ritual white shift, had soaked through the fabric in a spreading red stain she had been too overwhelmed to properly register. She looked at it with the vague, detached interest of someone whose body had been running on adrenaline and ceremony for several hours, and was only now beginning to report its actual status. I have a kit in the archive room, she said. You should also eat something. And perhaps, she glanced at the tattered remnants of his 5-century-old formal wear, we can find something else for you to wear. Kyle blinked at her. It was, she thought, the first entirely unguarded expression she had seen on his face. A genuine surprise that had gotten past his composure before he could stop it. You are very practical, he said. I have been living alone on a mountain managing a supernatural situation I did not fully understand for my entire adult life, Lyra said. Practical is what I have. If you are feeling the weight of this moment as much as we are, let us know in the comments what you think Kale is going to discover when he learns how much the world has changed. And if you have not subscribed yet, now is the perfect time, because this story is only beginning, and you do not want to miss what comes next. Part 3. The Weight of 5 Centuries. The archive room had not been designed with guests in mind. Being small and lined, floor to ceiling with shelving, and the accumulated texts of 7 generations of Ashvale Guardians, which meant that Kale, seated in the room's single chair, occupied approximately half the available space, and made the room feel considerably smaller than its already modest dimensions. Lyra worked around him with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to functioning in tight quarters, retrieving the medical kit from its place on the 3rd shelf and settling herself on the footstool across from him to address her palm. He watched her work. She was aware of the watching in the way she had always been aware of the flame's attention, a warmth and a presence at the edge of her peripheral perception that was not threatening, but was impossible to ignore. Let me, he said, when she had the bandaging material out, but was struggling to wrap her own hand one-handed. She looked up at him. He was watching her with that same careful, assessing quality, but there was something underneath it. Now that had not been there in the sanctum. Something that was perhaps simply the effect of 4 walls and a lamp instead of a roaring supernatural fire and a cracked stone floor. A humanizing of a situation that had been, until about 20 minutes ago, entirely outside the boundaries of anything Lyra had trained herself to expect. She extended her hand. He took it with a care that surprised her, his large hands enormously gentle, and she watched his face while he examined the cut with concentrated attention, determining it was clean and not dangerously deep, then beginning to wrap it with a methodical competence that suggested familiarity with field medicine. "You were a soldier," she said. "Among other things," he agreed. He did not look up from her hand. A pack does not stay united by ceremonies alone. There were border disputes and territorial incursions and internal conflicts that required physical resolution. I was present for all of them. The records that do survive. "From your period, describe the Alpha Eternal as a unifier," Lyra said carefully. "Someone who brought the fractured territories together under a common governance structure. The scholarly framing is usually political, diplomatic. The diplomatic work was real," Cale said. He finished wrapping her hand and released it, but did not immediately move away, remaining at the same careful distance that she had noted earlier as deliberate. So was the fighting. The two are not mutually exclusive. Territory unification requires convincing people who have been enemies for generations that cooperation serves them better than conflict. Sometimes that convincing happens at a table with words. Sometimes it happens in the field with teeth. Lyra thought about this. "And the governance structure you built," she said. "The early council. Was that your design?" Something shifted in his expression. "No," he said. "The council structure as it existed in my time was advisory. 9 representatives. From 9 territories, each with equal voice, meeting annually to address cross-territorial concerns. The authority was never meant to be concentrated. The Alpha Eternal position existed as a mediator, a voice without a vote, present to prevent deadlock, and ensure that no single territory's interest dominated the whole." He paused. "The Alpha Eternal was specifically designed to be powerful enough to balance the council, but not positioned to override it. Power without governance is tyranny. I believed that then. I believe it now." Lyra looked at him steadily. "The council as it currently exists," she said, "holds absolute governing authority over all 9 territories. They vote, they legislate, they enforce. There is no Alpha Eternal position in the current structure. According to the official historical account, the position was retired when you chose to ascend, and in your absence, the council assumed the governing responsibilities that had previously been distributed." Kyle was quiet. "The social hierarchy," Lyra continued, because she thought he needed to know, and she was not in the habit of softening things that mattered, "is also significantly changed from historical descriptions. The Alpha-Omega dynamic, which in your period was primarily biological designation with minimal social stratification, has been formalized and codified into a rigid class system. Omegas in the current structure have restricted access to pack leadership positions, reduced legal standing in territorial disputes, and limited inheritance rights." She glanced down at her wrapped hand. "I am Omega. In the current system, I have no pack affiliation, no territorial protection, and no legal recourse if someone decides the temple and its land should belong to someone else." Kyle's expression had gone very still in the way that things go still before they move, the stillness of something with a great deal of power, considering its next action very carefully. "They built their power on my disappearance," he said quietly, "and consolidated it over 500 years, Lyra said. "The current council elders are not the same people who imprisoned you. They are, at best, institutional beneficiaries of a structure built on a crime they may not even know occurred. At worst, they know exactly what happened and why, and they have very good reasons to ensure it remains unknown." She met his gaze. "If you resurface, they will view you as an existential threat to everything they have." built. "I am," Kyle said. There was no anger in it, no performance of menace. Simply a statement of fact delivered in the measured tone of someone who has had a great deal of time to develop a clear picture of his own nature and capabilities. Lyra found this, unexpectedly, reassuring. She had braced herself for rage. Rage she would have understood. 500 years of it would be entirely reasonable. But rage would also have been dangerous and difficult to manage in a small archive room on a mountain where she was the only other person present. The steadiness was something she could work with. "I need to show you something," she said. She rose from the footstool and moved to the shelving along the east wall, running her fingers along the spines of the bound journals until she found the ones she wanted, pulling 3 volumes and carrying them back to where he sat. "These are my family's records, all of them that survived." She set them in his hands. "Read whatever you need. I am going to get you something to eat." He looked at the journals, then he looked at her. "You trust me with these. You need information more than I need to guard my family's secrets," Lyra said simply. "And besides, they are your history as much as mine. More, perhaps." She went to the kitchen and made tea, and found the bread she had baked 2 days ago, and the dried fruit, and the hard cheese that kept well in the cold storage. And she put it all on a tray, and carried it back, and she found him, already deep in the oldest of the 3 journals, turning the pages with extraordinary care, his expression absorbed and intent and occasionally flickering through something that was too private to observe directly. She set the tray beside him and sat in the corner with her own cup and her current journal, and wrote down everything that had happened since she entered the sanctum, in the careful, detailed style her grandmother had taught her. Because whatever else was true, this was the most significant event in Ashvale Guardian history, and it deserved to be recorded. They sat in companionable silence for several hours, while the eclipse completed itself overhead, and the mountain settled into the deep quiet of late night. Part 4. Learning to trust the ground. The days that followed were, in Lyra's retrospective assessment, one of the strangest and most unexpectedly meaningful periods of her life. She had expected the presence of the Alpha Eternal in her small temple to be overwhelming, a disruption of the careful rhythms she had built over years of solitary life. She had expected to feel invaded or threatened, or at minimum significantly discomfited by the presence of someone so far outside the ordinary boundaries of her existence. Instead, she found, with a cautious amazement she was careful not to examine too closely for fear of disturbing it, that Kale occupied space in a way that was remarkably considerate for someone who had spent 5 centuries in supernatural imprisonment, and could reasonably have been expected to emerge somewhat destabilized in his relationship with other beings. He was quiet in the way of someone who had learned to value quiet. He was careful with the temple's fragile things, the old texts, the ritual objects, the garden she kept in the southern courtyard that he regarded on his first morning above ground, with an expression of such focused attention that she had stood watching him from the doorway for a full minute, before he turned and found her there. "Marigolds," he said. "Yes," she said. "And thyme, rosemary, several varieties of sage. The lavender did not survive last winter, but I am trying again. My mother kept a garden," he said. He looked back at the careful beds of late-season herbs, the marigolds still blazing orange gold against the autumn brown of the mountain. "I had forgotten what it looked like to tend things." She did not say anything about this. She understood about the forgetting and the remembering, about the way long isolation eroded not just social skills, but the capacity to remember what ordinary life felt like from the inside. She simply went to the garden and resumed the late-season work she had been planning to do. And after a moment, he followed, and she showed him what needed doing, and they worked side by side in the cool morning air, while the mountain showed them its sky. He was learning the current world the way she had learned the ritual texts, systematically, and with focused attention and an almost eerie lack of expressed alarm at the things he discovered. She had prepared herself to manage his reactions to the extent of change in 5 centuries. The technology, the political geography, the social restructuring. What she found was that he absorbed each new piece of information with the same careful steadiness he had applied to the revelation of his imprisonment's duration, filing it into a growing picture, asking precise clarifying questions, and reserving judgment until he had enough information to form a considered opinion. You have a remarkable capacity to process difficult information without visible distress, she told him one evening, about a week after his emergence, when they were seated in the sanctum after the evening observation, the flame burning between them at its new height and color, slightly brighter than it had been in all her years of tending it, as though his presence was doing something to its fundamental nature. Kyle considered this. He had shed the remnants of his 5-century-old clothing on the second day, exchanging them for the closest things she had been able to provide from her own storage and the limited township market at which she occasionally traded, the result being functional if not elegant, practical clothing that nonetheless could not quite disguise the quality of the person wearing it. He looked, she thought, like someone who had decided that the current circumstances were what they were, and that performing distress would serve no practical purpose. "I spent 500 years in a sealed chamber," he said. "In the first months, perhaps the first decade, I experienced significant distress. After that, the distress became something else, not acceptance. I never accepted what had been done to me, but the energy that distress consumed needed to be redirected into something that would serve me better." He paused. "I thought. I planned. I reconstructed, from memory, everything I knew about governance and territorial structures and the people who had been part of my world at the time of my imprisonment, trying to understand how each of them might have responded to my disappearance, what structures they might have built in the absence of what I represented." He looked at the flame. "I was wrong about many things. The world changed more radically than I anticipated. But the practice of thinking systematically rather than emotionally about my situation kept me from losing myself. Entirely. 500 years is a long time to remain yourself," Lyra said softly. "I am not certain I am entirely who I was before," he said. "I think some of what I was is gone. The easy confidence, perhaps. The assumption that the world is generally ordered toward reasonable outcomes." He was quiet for a moment. "But the core of what I believe, about how power should function, about what it means to lead well, about the responsibilities of the strong toward those in their care, those I held, those are still mine." Lyra thought about this. She thought about what it meant to hold your core beliefs through 500 years of being punished for them by the very people who should have shared them. She thought about what kind of person emerges from that experience still believing in those things, still committed to them, not despite the suffering, but in some strange and important way because of it, because the suffering had made the beliefs impossible to hold casually or, theoretically, had forced them to be examined and re-examined and chosen deliberately each time. "What do you plan to do?" she asked. He looked at her. "I do not yet know enough to plan effectively," he said. "I need more information about the current council's structure and the 9 territories' political relationships. I need to understand what documentation survives from my period and what has been destroyed or altered. I need to know what, if any, knowledge of the Alpha Eternal position still exists in the public consciousness, and in what form." His eyes held hers steadily. "And I need to know whether you are willing to help me." The question was direct, and asked without pressure, with the quality she had come to associate with him of presenting a genuine choice genuinely, rather than as a social formula expecting a predetermined response. "I am already helping you," Lyra said. "I have been helping you for a week. Providing shelter and information is not the same as choosing to stand beside someone when the council discovers he has returned," Cale said. "Those are 2 very different levels of commitment with very different risks. I will not pretend otherwise." Lyra looked at the flame. She thought about 7 generations of Ashvale women on this mountain, tending this fire, believing in something they could not fully see or understand, sustaining a sacred duty through mockery and isolation, and the particular exhausting grief of being certain about something no one around you will acknowledge. She thought about the page in Mara's archive notes, and the phrase she had carried for 11 months like a stone in her chest. Whatever emerges, she must remember that the flame chose her line for a reason, and the reason was not weakness. "My family has tended that flame for more than 300 documented years," she said. Longer than that in oral tradition. We did it without knowing why. We did it when our neighbors thought we were foolish. We did it when the council declared the guardianship a relic and offered our family a settlement to abandon the temple and relocate to a proper pack settlement. She paused. My mother turned the settlement down. My grandmother before her. I would have turned it down myself. She looked at him. I did not know what I was guarding. But I knew the guarding mattered. I knew it with a certainty I could not explain to anyone who asked, which is partly why I stopped trying to explain. She took a slow breath. I think, you are what my family has been standing sentinel for. I think that is the reason the flame chose us. Not because we were the most powerful or the most skilled or the most connected, but because we were the kind of people who would keep a faith no one else could see the point of. For as long as it needed keeping. She met his gaze steadily. And if that is true, then yes, I am with you. Not because I have no choice, because I choose to be. Kyle was quiet for a long moment. The flame moved between them, higher and warmer than it had been in all her years alone. Thank you, he said. It was the simplest thing he had said to her since his emergence, and the most weighted. If this story is finding you somewhere in your own waiting, in your own years of tending something that the world around you cannot seem to see the value of, tell us in the comments. We believe you, and we are so glad you are still here. Part 5. The council stirs. She had known they would find out. She had known it in the abstract, in the way she knew abstractly that eclipses end and winters come. Inevitable events on a calendar that could be predicted even if the exact shape of them remained unclear until they arrived. What she had not anticipated was how quickly, or in what form the discovery would manifest. It was 11 days after Kyle's emergence. She was in the township below, the first time she had been down the mountain since before the eclipse, purchasing supplies with the careful economy of someone who had been managing limited resources alone for years and knew exactly how much everything cost and how far it needed to stretch. The township's marketplace was small and familiar, the same 6 vendors in the same arrangement they had occupied for years, and she moved through it with the practiced invisibility of someone who had long since made her peace with being regarded as an eccentric necessity rather than a member of the community. She was at the grain vendor's stall when she overheard the conversation she had been dreading. 2 men she recognized as employees of the Regional Territory Administration, paper shufflers with the look of city offices about them, were speaking to the vendor with the particular focused casualness of people conducting an inquiry they do not want to appear to be conducting. They were asking about the eclipse, about unusual events in the area, about the Ashvale Temple, and whether anyone had noticed anything strange. Lyra paid for her grain, with her face carefully arranged in its habitual expression of polite, nondescript neutrality, and left the market at a pace that was not quite hurried and not quite ordinary, and climbed the mountain as fast as she reasonably could without appearing to run. Cale received her news the way he received most information, with focused attention and immediate redirection toward practicalities. How much time do you estimate we have? He asked. Days, perhaps, Lyra said. Local administration reporting. To regional administration reporting to the territorial representative. The territorial representative has access to the council. If this rises to council-level attention, which it will, the response will be significant. She was moving through the archive room pulling specific texts as she spoke, the ones that contained the most sensitive historical documentation, the ones she did not want seized. There are things here that cannot be allowed to fall into council hands, documents that corroborate what you have told me about the original council's advisory structure. Mara's notes about the convergence. She stacked them in her arms. I have a place in the mountain, a natural cave I found when I was a child. The council's people will search the temple. They may not know about the cave. You are protecting evidence, Kyle said. I am protecting evidence and I am protecting options, Lyra said. If we have documentation, we have something to take to people who might be persuaded, to act on it. Without documentation, we have your word against 500 years of established historical narrative. Kale was quiet for a moment. Then he said, You have been thinking about this since before they came. She paused. I have been thinking about it since the night of the eclipse, she said honestly. Every day since you emerged, I have been cataloging what we know, what we can prove, and what the likely responses are from various parties if they become aware of your existence. I did not tell you because you had enough to process, and because the contingency planning was something I could do on your behalf while you were learning the landscape. She met his gaze levelly. I may have overstepped. You did not overstep, Cale said. There was something in his voice she had not heard there before. A warmth that was different from the steady respect that had characterized most of their interactions. You were caring for the mission while I was recovering enough to care for it. Myself. That is not overstepping. That is partnership. Lyra held his gaze for a moment. Then she held out half the stack of texts she was carrying. He took them without being asked, understanding immediately that they needed to move. They worked quickly and in concert, carrying the most sensitive materials to the cave, while Lyra also moved through the temple, doing the specific preparations for an inspection visit, neutralizing anything that would immediately give away the nature of recent events, setting the sanctum back into the appearance of ordinary ritual space, with the cracked floor and the still open chamber below, carefully covered with a weighted mat, she dragged from the archive room. The flame she could not do much about. It still burned higher and whiter than its habitual amber gold, but she arranged the room so that the view of it from the sanctum doorway was partially obscured, and she told herself that a moderately heightened flame was not in itself sufficient. Evidence of anything a council inspector could act on. The inspection arrived 3 days later in the form of 4 people. Not territory administrators, but something worse. Council inquiry officers. Recognizable by the gray sash they wore over their formal clothing and the specific cold professional quality of their manner, the affect of people trained to notice and record and assess and report without expressing opinions in the field. Lyra received them at the outer courtyard gate with the composed courtesy she had prepared. The particular presentation she had been practicing since childhood, in the endless rehearsals of a girl who knew she would always need to justify her existence to people with more institutional power than her, and had decided that dignity and competence were the only armors available to her. Guardian Ashvale, the lead officer said. Female, approximately 40, with the contained watchfulness of someone who was very good at her job. My name is Senior. Inspector Veleth. We are conducting a regional survey in response to reports of unusual phenomena associated with last week's lunar event. We understand your temple is situated at the primary focal point of the Greyvale Territory's Sacred Site Registry. It is, Lyra said. Please come in. I will make tea. She gave them a tour. She answered their questions with the careful truth of someone who knew that selective honesty was far more sustainable than outright deception. Focusing on the eclipse, observation she had performed, the flame's temporary intensification during the lunar event, a known and documented occurrence in the Ashvale records that she could produce for their inspection, and the minor structural damage to the basalt bowl, which she showed them the fragments of. She answered their questions about unusual scents or presences in the temple, with a calm that she maintained through sheer practice, the same calm she brought to the midnight hours on the mountain when the wind sounded like voices, and the isolation pressed like a hand. Inspector Veleth was thorough. Lyra had expected nothing less, and had prepared accordingly. They inspected every room. They lingered in the sanctum longer than anywhere else, standing before the flame with the specific arrested quality of people who have been trained not to show surprise, and are currently working harder than usual to maintain that discipline. They asked about the weighted mat in the center of the floor, and Lyra told them it covered a section of damaged stone, which was true, and produced the same even cadence of voice, and the same direct eye contact she maintained throughout. Because the truth, even a partial truth, has a texture that experienced professionals can sometimes detect, and she needed every possible alignment between what she said and what her body communicated. They left in the late afternoon without finding Cale. He was in the cave, with the texts, and he had agreed without discussion to remain there for as long as the inspection lasted, another instance of the wordless coordination that had been developing between them since the beginning, the ability to understand the operational necessity without requiring it to be explained in detail. When she climbed the slope to the cave entrance that evening, and found him there with a lantern and 3 of the Ashvale journals open around him, and the focused, contained expression of someone who has been putting a long time to productive use. She said, "They are gone. They did not find anything actionable." He looked up. Something released in him, small and controlled, that she thought she might have missed if she had not been paying attention. "You managed them well," he said. "I have been managing the outside world's interest in this mountain my entire life," she said. She sat down across from him in the cave, pulling her knees up and wrapping her arms around them, feeling the adrenaline of the day finally beginning to clear and the tiredness beginning to arrive in its place. "I am very good at it by now." Cal looked at her with the expression she had learned to associate with him, noticing something for the first time that had been present all along, the expression of catching up to a reality that had been waiting for him to reach it. "You have been protecting this place alone," he said, "from people who did not respect what you were doing, for your entire life." "Yes," Lyra said. "And you were doing that when no one believed in what you were guarding," he said, "not knowing what you were guarding, just because you believed the guarding mattered. That is what my family does," she said simply. Kyle was quiet for a moment. "I was alone for 500 years, he said at last. "And you were alone for 23, and I think your version was perhaps harder, because you were surrounded by a world that could see you and chose not to take you seriously, while my isolation was at least complete." Lyra considered this. "I do not know which is harder," she said honestly. "I think they are different kinds of difficult." "Yes," he said. "I think so too." They sat together in the cave with the lantern between them and the mountain around them, and the difficulty of everything that had been, and the difficulty of everything that was coming did not go away, but it was, Lyra thought, considerably more bearable shared. Part 6. What cannot stay hidden. The weeks that followed the inspection established a new pattern in their days, a careful, considered life built around the twin necessities of Kale's preparation and their collective security. The Council's interest in the Greyvale territory had not dissipated with the inspection's inconclusive results, which they both knew. Inspector Veleth was too good at her job to have been entirely satisfied with what she found, which meant resources would continue to be directed toward watching the temple's surrounding region, and that any significant movement from the mountain would attract attention. This was, Lyra had pointed out with characteristic practicality, both a constraint and an opportunity. The constraint was obvious. The opportunity was that the enforced stillness gave them time. Time for Kale to complete his education in the current world's structures. Time for Lyra to establish communication with the limited number of people she thought might be trusted and useful. Time for the preparation of what they were increasingly calling in their quiet evening conversations the case. The case rested on several elements. The physical evidence of the sealed chamber beneath the sanctum, which existed and was accessible to inspection by any credible external party. The Ashvale family's documented records, which, read as a continuous whole rather than individual fragments, told a story about the flame and its maintenance that was deeply inconsistent with the official narrative of the Alpha Eternal's willing ascension. The Awaken's discrepancy between the original Council charter documents, of which Kale had a precise memory, and which differed significantly from the current Council's claimed historical mandate, which could be tested against any surviving original documents that might exist in territory archives. And Kale himself, whose existence was the most fundamental refutation of the official history, who was very much alive and present, and 500 years of wrongful imprisonment, angry about it in the particular, controlled way that was more frightening than open rage, because it was patient and because it was going to last. The communications Lyra established were careful and slow, conducted through the network of scholarly correspondence she had built over years of research into the Ashvale records. She had relationships with 2 university archivists, a retired territorial judge who had a documented interest in historical legal structures, and a journalist who covered academic affairs for one of the larger territory news publications, and who had twice referenced, in published work, the suspicious gaps in the historical record around the Alpha Eternal period. These were not powerful people. They were people who cared about truth, which Lyra had decided, after much thought, was more useful in the long run. She wrote to them carefully, revealing nothing that was not absolutely necessary, asking questions designed to establish their current positions on historical accountability and counsel, oversight before revealing anything that would change the nature of the risk they were accepting by engaging with her. She had learned, a long time ago, that the way to ask for help was to understand what the other person was willing to give before asking for more than they had. Cale, who reviewed her draft letters with the eye of someone who had spent a great deal of his pre-imprisonment time in diplomatic correspondence, offered occasional suggestions with the same ease he had brought to the garden work and the archive organization, a willingness to contribute without requiring that the contribution be acknowledged as anything other than what it was. She found this, as she found most things about him, surprisingly compatible with her own working style. "You write well," he said one evening, returning a draft to her with a single suggested revision in the margin. "I have been writing to people outside this mountain since I was 14, and discovered that the only way to get access to academic resources was to correspond directly with the people who held them," Lyra said. "I have had considerable practice. It shows," he said. "The revision is minor. The emotional calibration of the last paragraph is slightly too revealing. You want them to understand the stakes, without quite yet understanding how personal the stakes are for you." Lyra looked at the revision. He was right. She changed it. The growing ease of their collaboration did not resolve the other thing. The thing. She had been carefully not examining for the sake of her own composure. The fact that the Alpha Eternal's presence in her space and her life had a quality that she did not have appropriate language for, that was not quite friendship, and not quite the mentor-pupil dynamic of the early days, and was increasingly not quite anything she had a word for, only a texture. A warmth she noticed most clearly in the moments when his attention was elsewhere, and she allowed herself to observe him without the social obligation of appearing unmoved. She knew what it was. She was Omega, and he was Alpha, and some things were legible in the oldest parts of the body, long before the mind agreed to acknowledge them. But she also knew that the situation was as complicated as situations could be, that he was ancient and she was young, that he was working to reclaim a world he had been stolen from while she was trying to figure out what her own life was. For now that the guardianship had been fulfilled in the way she had never anticipated, that the power differential was enormous in multiple directions simultaneously, and that she had no intention of allowing the oldest instincts in her body to override the careful consideration that the situation required. What she did not fully account for was that he was having the same conversation with himself. She found this out inadvertently, in the cave one morning, when she brought the daily texts up, and found him still, in the particular arrested stillness. She had learned to associate with him being in the middle of thinking something through rather than having completed it. He surfaced from the thought when she entered and said, without preamble, "I need to tell you something." Lyra set down the texts and gave him her full attention. "In my period," he said carefully, "the mate bond was understood as something that presented itself as a possibility, rather than a compulsion. The biology created the potential. The individuals involved made the choice." He was watching her with that steady, precise gaze. "The cultural narrative around it has changed significantly in the current period, based on the texts I have been reading. It is now commonly described as involuntary, irresistible, destiny expressed through biology." "Yes," Lyra said carefully. "That is the dominant current understanding." "I do not share that understanding," Cale said. "I am telling you this because I want to be transparent about something that is otherwise a complication neither of us has addressed out loud." He did not look away from her. "There is a potential here. I am aware of it. I expect you are also aware of it. And I want you to know that I have no intention of treating it as anything other than what it is, a potential, which means a possibility that requires the choice of both parties, and which I will not allow to function as any kind of pressure in a situation where you are already managing significant external pressures that require your full attention and agency." Lyra looked at him for a long moment. She thought about what it meant that this was the conversation he had chosen to have, this careful, explicit delineation of choice and consent and mutual respect, rather than allowing the potential to simply accumulate unaddressed in the way that things do when people are living in close proximity, under intense shared circumstances. "Thank you," she said, "for saying it out loud." "You are welcome," he said, "and you do not need to respond to it with anything beyond acknowledgement. I simply did not want to be holding it silently while expecting you to navigate the same space without knowing I was holding it. I appreciate that," she said. She was quiet for a moment. "I am also aware of it," she said, "and I also believe in choice. And I think that the choices we need to make right now are primarily about what we are doing together, for reasons that are larger than either of us." She met his gaze. "The rest can wait until we have the room to make it properly." Something in his expression settled into a warmth that was not quite a smile, but occupied the same territory. "Yes," he said. "I think so too." Part 7. The Long Road to Truth. The first public acknowledgement of Cale's existence was not planned. It was, in the way that the most significant moments often are, the result of a small thing going differently than expected. The retired territorial judge, whose name was Unwittingly, and who had corresponded with Lyra for 6 years about historical legal structures, arrived at the temple unannounced. He was 70 years old and had driven 3 territories to get there in a vehicle he clearly should not have been operating alone, and he stood in the outer courtyard in the early morning fog and said, when Lyra came to the gate, "I received your last letter, and I thought the matter required a conversation rather than further correspondence. I apologize for not writing ahead. I was concerned about the security of the mail." He was right to be concerned about the mail, which she had suspected for several weeks, and she let him in. He met Cale in the archive room 20 minutes later, and was quiet for a very long time. "You understand?" he said finally. "That this is going to require more than the 3 of us." "Yes," Lyra said. "You also understand that what you are proposing, a formal historical review of the Council's founding documents against independent evidence of the original governance structure, is going to be treated as a direct attack on current institutional legitimacy." "Yes," Kyle said. Oswin looked at them both with the expression of someone who has spent a career studying legal precedent and is now confronted with the most significant case in 500 years. "I am 70 years old," he said thoughtfully, "and I have been writing about the gaps in the Alpha Eternal historical record for 35 of those years. My professional reputation has suffered for it. My colleagues have regarded me as a crank." He paused. "I find that I am unexpectedly willing to be a crank on a much larger stage." He looked at Cale. "I have questions." "Ask them," Cale said. The conversation that followed lasted 4 hours. At the end of it, Oswin Thales had produced from his coat a physical copy of a document he had spent 30 years attempting to have acknowledged as authentic by the territorial archives, a partial transcript of the original council charter in a hand that he had established was contemporaneous with Cale's period, which described the Alpha Eternal's role in terms that were almost precisely what Cale had described from memory. The council had declared the document a forgery. Oswin had never stopped believing it was real. "The handwriting," Kyle said, examining it. "This is Mira Aldenvost. She was the charter scrivener. I knew her." His voice was quiet. "She had a distinctive way of forming the capital letters, the curve at the base of the T. I would know her hand anywhere." Oswin looked at him. "You knew the person who wrote this." "She was 70 when I knew her," Cale said. "She had been the council's official scrivener for 40 years. She was meticulous and honest, and if she wrote what is in this document, this is what the charter said." Oswin sat back. Something in his face had shifted into the expression of a man who has been carrying a weight for 35 years, and has just found, unexpectedly, that the weight has been set down. "Then we have a starting point," he said. They had more than a starting point. Over the following months, through the careful work of people who believed in truth because they had paid the price for believing in it, the evidence assembled. The journalist, whose name was Petra Solin, and who arrived at the mountain 2 months after Oswin with 3 colleagues and a security protocol she had developed for exactly this kind of story, conducted the first interviews, careful and documented and witnessed. The 2 university archivists, Drs. Kane and Yvette Marsh, who were a married pair and arrived together with an equipment van and the kind of professional focus that Lyra found deeply reassuring, undertook the physical examination of the sealed chamber and the cave documentation, and produced a report that was, in their shared professional opinion, consistent with a 5-century-old occupation of the space. The council became aware of what was happening before they were ready for the council to become aware, because that is how these things go, and the response was swift, and followed the exact pattern Lyra had anticipated in her earliest contingency planning. Denial, legal challenge, discrediting campaigns directed at each of the individuals involved, and finally, when the evidence proved too substantial for the standard mechanisms to suppress, a controlled narrative of their own, a story about a historical misunderstanding, a tragedy of well-intentioned but flawed decision-making, an unfortunate event that the current council, naturally bearing no responsibility for the actions of their predecessors, was prepared to address in an appropriate and measured fashion. The appropriate and measured fashion notably did not include any acknowledgement of Kale as a legitimate authority or any offer of genuine accountability. This did not surprise anyone involved in the effort, and Lyra had prepared for it as she had prepared for most things, with the methodical attention of someone who had learned that the first answer is rarely the final answer, and that patience, consistently applied, is a form of power. The public dissemination of the evidence changed the landscape. The territories, which had been living for 500 years with a governance structure that had been built on a lie, did not respond uniformly. Some territorial leaders saw in the revelation an opportunity for reform they had long been unable to pursue in the face of council. Resistance. Others doubled down on institutional loyalty. The majority occupied the uncertain middle ground of people confronted with information that required them to revise their understanding of the world they had thought they knew, which is an uncomfortable position, and one that produces unpredictable responses. The social hierarchy questions, the alpha-omega stratification that the council had codified and enforced, emerged as the most combustible element of the public conversation. Lyra had anticipated this in the abstract, but found the reality of it more complicated than her models had accounted for. Because the people most directly affected by the hierarchical structures, the Omegas across all 9 territories who had been living with restricted legal standing and reduced opportunity for 500 years, did not respond to the revelation with the unified, clear demand for change that would have been most practically useful. They responded with the full range of human complexity, some with immediate and passionate engagement, some with skepticism about whether anything would actually change regardless of what was revealed, some with fear of the backlash that reform efforts might provoke, some with the particular exhaustion of people who have been waiting for things to change for so long that they have made a kind of peace with waiting. Lyra understood all of these responses. She had experienced versions of all of them herself at various points in the 23 years of her life on the mountain. She engaged with them with the care and patience they deserved, not trying to override the complexity with simple narratives, not pretending that revelation automatically created change, acknowledging that the work of actual reform was larger and slower and more difficult than any single person or any single moment of truth could accomplish. Kyle watched her do this with the expression she had come to associate with him, recognizing something he had known before but was learning again in a new form. "You are better at this than I was," he said one evening, after a long call with the advocacy group that had formed around the Omega rights question. Lyra looked at him. "I am Omega," she said simply. "I know what these concerns feel like from the inside. I know the particular fear of having one's hope used against them. I know the exhaustion of being told that this time it will be different." She was quiet for a moment. "What I can offer is not just my belief that it will be different. It is the evidence of my own experience, that it is possible to hold on to what you know is right through years of being told you are wrong, and that the holding has value regardless of whether it is immediately rewarded." Kale was quiet. The flame, visible through the open sanctum door at the end of the hall, burned steady and white between them. "When this is over," he said carefully, "when the structural work is done, I want to talk to you about something." Lyra looked at him. "I remember the conversation we agreed to table," she said. "Yes," he said. "That one. We can talk about it when we have room to do it properly," she said. "As we agreed." He nodded. His expression carried the warmth she had learned to read, the warmth that was not performed or strategic but simply there, in the lines of his face and the quality of his attention, real and consistent, and patient in the way of something that has decided it can afford to wait, because it knows it is not going anywhere. If this story is touching something real in you, something about the long wait, or the faith that keeps going even when the ground is uncertain, we want to hear from you. Drop a comment and tell us what part of Lyra's or Kale's journey you recognize from your own life. Your words matter here. This community is built by you. Part 8. The Reckoning. The formal council hearing that resulted from the accumulated pressure of evidence and public attention was neither as swift nor as clean as the most optimistic projections had suggested it might be, and it was considerably less catastrophic than the most pessimistic ones. It was, like most genuine moments of institutional reckoning, slow and untidy, and full of people attempting to navigate the gap between what was true and what was comfortable. And Lyra sat through all 43 hours of it spread across 11 days with the focused patience that was, at this point, perhaps her defining characteristic. Kale's formal appearance before the assembled council was the event that the media coverage centered, the moment that the journalists and commentators had been positioning for since the story broke. The dramatic confrontation between the imprisoned Alpha and the institutional successors of his imprisoners. Lyra had spent considerable time helping him prepare for it, and considerably more time after those preparations, quietly setting aside her own feelings about the fact that, whatever this moment became, it was going to be largely beyond her ability to control. He walked into the hearing chamber with the unhurried authority of someone who had been the most powerful person in the room before the oldest person currently living had been born, and the effect was everything she had anticipated, and somehow still more than she had fully prepared for, a quality of presence that was not performance and not intimidation, but simply the weight of someone who knew exactly who they were and had had 500 years to become completely certain of it. He did not demand. He documented. He presented the case with the precision and the controlled power of someone who understood that the goal was not satisfaction, but outcome. Not the pleasure of the confrontation, but the actual change in actual structures, for the actual benefit of actual people who had been living under inadequate governance for 5 centuries. He answered questions with the directness that had characterized every conversation Lyra had witnessed, the directness of someone who had decided that truth was the only tool that had any chance of working, and who was therefore committed to deploying it without reservation. The council fractured, as she had projected it would, along the fault lines that the preceding months of public conversation had revealed. 3 of the 9 territorial representatives came into the hearing having already publicly committed to structural reform. 2 more moved in that direction over the course of the proceedings in response to the evidence. The remaining 4 held their positions with varying degrees of conviction, and it was these 4 who produced the most difficult moments, the challenges and the legal objections, and the alternative historical framings that required the patient, documented rebuttals that Oswin and the Marsh archivists had prepared. In the end, the resolution was neither complete nor permanent, because resolutions of this kind never are. What the hearing produced was a formal acknowledgement of the historical record's falsification, a structural review commission charged with examining the council charter against the original documentation, a transitional governance arrangement that created a restored advisory alpha position that Kale agreed, after considerable private deliberation, to occupy temporarily while the commission did its work, and a separate but connected process to review the alpha-omega social stratification laws, which was given its own commission, with explicit representation from omega advocacy groups, and a 2-year mandate to produce reform recommendations. It was not everything. Lyra had never expected everything, because she had spent her whole life understanding that what you can build in one moment is always partial, and that the building continues across time. What it was real and documented, and an actual change in the actual structure that would affect actual people. She was standing in the corridor outside the hearing chamber when it was done, leaning against the stone wall with her eyes closed and the particular exhaustion of someone who has been operating at maximum capacity for a very long time, and has just reached the moment where it is permissible to briefly stop, when she heard his footsteps, and then felt the warmth of him close beside her, not touching, but near enough that she was aware of him the way she was always aware of him, with her whole body. "It is done," he said. "For now," she said. "The commission will take at least a year. The reform process longer." "Yes," he said. "But the foundation is real." She opened her eyes and looked at him. He was looking at her with the warmth that was not performed, and with something else beneath it that was softer than she had seen there before. The softness of someone who has arrived at a place they were not certain they would reach. "I believe you said," Cale said carefully, "that some things needed to wait until we had room." Lyra looked at him for a long moment. "I did say that. We have room," he said. "Or at least more room than we have had." He paused. "I am not asking for a decision. I am asking for a conversation." She thought about the cave and the archive room and the courtyard garden, and 11 months of a faith she could not explain, tending a flame she did not fully understand. And she thought about 500 years of patient waiting for something that turned out to be exactly what had always been expected. And she thought about what it meant that the entire complicated story of both their lives had arrived at this corridor, this moment, this particular careful man looking at her with more patience than anyone had ever looked at her with in her life. "I would like a conversation," she said. He offered her his hand. She took it with the hand that was no longer bandaged, fully healed. The faint scar of the ritual cut a clean line across her palm that she had decided privately she was going to keep the way she kept other important things, visibly and without apology. They walked out of the hearing building together into a gray autumn afternoon that smelled like the first real rain of the season coming in from the east, and they talked, slowly and with the care that everything between them had always been handled with. And the talking did not resolve everything, or explain everything, or promise more than the present moment could honestly contain. But it was real, and it was chosen. And that, Lyra had learned on a mountain with a flame and a faith no one believed in, was always the place worth beginning from. Epilogue. The flame that holds. 3 years later, the courtyard garden at Greymount Temple had been significantly expanded. This was, Lyra reflected, tending the new section of lavender that had finally, after 2 failed attempts, established itself properly in the mountain soil. Perhaps the most reliable measure of how things had changed, not the governance reforms or the commission reports or the new social stratification laws that the Omega rights process had produced. Though all of those things mattered, and she tracked their implementation with the same meticulous attention she had brought to the Ashevale archive records. The most reliable measure was the garden, because a garden reflects how much time and peace you have to grow things, and the fact that she had managed to finally get the lavender to take was evidence that her days had reached a steadiness she had not previously known. The temple was different too. It remained the home she had always known. The archive room and the kitchen and the small sleeping quarters that had been built into the mountain over generations, but it had expanded to accommodate the occasional presence of people who needed to be here, the archivists who came to continue the historical documentation work, the advocacy group members who had learned that the mountain was a good place for difficult conversations, the territorial representatives who came to consult with Kyle on the continuing structural work. She had, after some consideration, added a proper meeting room in the east wing, converting a storage space with the help of 2 builders from the township below, who had, somewhat to her surprise, been glad to work on the temple for the first time in her memory. The township was different with her now. Not fully changed, not the wholesale transformation of community. Relationships that made for satisfying fictional narratives, but was not particularly realistic, but different in the incremental and genuine way that things change when the material circumstances underlying social dynamics actually shift. She was no longer the mountain-crazy woman in the same simple way. She was the last Ashevale guardian, which was still complicated and still not always entirely comfortable as a social identity, but it was complicated in new ways, and it was hers in ways she had not fully been able to claim before. The flame still burned in the sanctum. It had not returned to its old amber gold, maintaining the higher, whiter quality that had arrived with Cale's emergence, and which she had come to think of as its true color, the color it had always wanted to be, and had been unable to sustain alone. When she walked into the sanctum each morning for the observation rite, which she still maintained, because the habit was part of her, and the flame still responded to it with that small movement of welcome. She felt what she always felt in that room, the presence of everyone who had stood where she was standing, her grandmother's patient hands, and her mother's quiet certainty, and Mara's 7-generation-ago faith that the convergence would come, and the guardian who stood in it would not flinch. She had not flinched. She was still here. Cale found her in the lavender section in the late morning, coming from the meeting room where he had spent the previous 2 hours in a consultation with 3 of the territorial reform commissioners. He had the look he always had after those meetings, focused and slightly tired in the way of someone doing work that mattered and knew it. And he sat on the low stone wall at the garden's edge and watched her work for a moment before saying, "The Eastern Territory Commission wants to extend the stratification review timeline. There are complications in the legal translation of the Omega representation requirements. There will always be complications," Lyra said, not looking up from the lavender. "That is not a reason not to proceed. It is a reason to proceed carefully." "Yes," he said. "I told them that." She looked up. He was watching her with the expression she had never stopped noticing. The warmth and the precision and the particular quality of attention that remained, 3 years in, unchanged in its essence, though deepened in its familiarity. She thought about what it meant to be chosen by someone who had had 500 years to think about what choosing meant, who came to it with a clarity that was the product of extraordinary duration and extraordinary patience, and the deep understanding that came from having everything stripped away until only the essential remained. She thought about what it meant to choose in return from a position of equal deliberateness. She who had spent her entire adult life making a choice no one around her could understand, tending a faith in something she could not fully see because she knew the tending mattered, and finding that this was the same capacity that made it possible to choose another person with the same whole and committed attention, to say, yes, this is real and worth tending, and I intend to tend it. "Come here," she said. He rose from the wall and came to where she was kneeling in the lavender, and he crouched beside her in the way he had learned from 2 seasons of garden work, comfortable in the soil and the patient work of growing things. And she took his hand with the hand that carried the faint healed scar across the palm, and they stayed there together in the morning on the mountain, the smell of lavender around them, and the mountain in its autumn gold, and the flame burning steady and white in the sanctum behind them. There would be more work tomorrow. There was always more work. The structures took time to change, and the people inside them took longer, and the habits of 500 years did not dissolve in 3. And she knew this, and accepted it with the same patient certainty that had been her inheritance and her practice, and the bone-deep gift of being born into a family that understood the value of staying. But today the lavender was finally growing, and the flame was burning, and the man beside her had chosen to be here, and she had chosen to let him, and whatever came next would be faced the same way everything had been faced, with honesty and patience, and the faith that the tending itself was never wasted, that what you keep alive with care and commitment becomes, in time, exactly what it was always meant to be. Thank you so much for being here for this story. If Lyra's journey spoke to something in you, something about the long wait, the invisible faith, the tending of things no one else can see the value of, please leave a comment and share it with us. This community is made of people who understand that kind of devotion, and your presence here is proof that the keeping of faith is not a lonely thing, even when it feels like it. Subscribe if you have not already, because the stories we tell here are for exactly the kind of people who stayed until the end of this one. And until next time, keep tending your flames. The convergence is always closer than it seems.